Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site that, of course, covers your Arizona Cardinals. With me is Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, one of our traditional normal shows that we record early in the week, recording on a Tuesday night as we have done most cases. Seth from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site. And we are here in episode, this is where it gets tricky because Howard hasn't given me audio updates, so we are at episode 580. I can't believe we've done that many shows, and I know that's been boosted up with Howard's audios, which is nice. So for those of you who listen to the show, you get a little mix up of all sorts of things. You get our longer shows with Seth and me. You get, and as the season goes, we'll have two longer shows. You'll have me previewing, ideally with an opponent writer, and then I'll have Seth Howard's audio updates throughout the week. So there will be plenty of audio content coming from the podcast over the next, I think if more audio content is what you were looking for, well, fantastic. And if you weren't, well, you get it anyway. Seth, we're down to 1 week away from roster cuts, and while we won't have a specific roster projection show unless you want to later this week, we will get to react next week to the roster cuts, because we will record next week after the Cardinals make their initial cuts, which means by the time the show drops, they will have already claimed other guys off waivers, and then the final roster probably will look different. But two preseason games down, no starters have played, and we get to the final game this week against the Denver Broncos on the road. I can't imagine how excited you are for this game.
Oh yeah, this is gonna blow expectations out of the water, right? With probably the Broncos not playing many guys. Obviously, the Cardinals haven't played their starters all preseason. I mean, I guess we can say they sort of played them a little bit at some points. But
Marvin Harrison had 3 snaps.
Yeah, so this is going to be interesting because I think we're excited about getting this over with. It's a great chance and experience for a lot of these kids that are looking for the next step in their career. We saw the move of veteran Dennis Daly getting released already because, they're done with him. And then today they made a couple other moves that kind of just tell us that maybe some of these guys that we're getting a lot of playing time just aren't going to see the field this week. And so it's going to be fun to watch that develop as we figure out, who makes the roster and who doesn't. But for the most part, man, I think you and I are both just excited to get to some, real games where we see what this team is. And you and I were talking about it off the air. What is this overall expectation and things like that when it comes to this coaching staff, not playing their guys in the preseason? Like, they've basically done that now for 2 years. How does that look at the end? And will the outcome change, or is this a terrible strategy? I guess it's yet to be decided, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things we will touch on in this show. We'll look back at the Cardinals' preseason loss last Saturday to the Indianapolis Colts, 21-13. Not that the final score matters, but we'll talk about the good and bad from that. We will talk about some roster moves, what we think of the starters not playing this preseason, and while we won't do any particularly roster predictions, who do we think might be some surprise cuts or potential trades? Let's start with the game on Saturday, 21-13. The loss to the Colts, kind of a tale of two halves. They started slowly, they took a halftime lead, and then the offense stopped working and the defense stopped working, and they gave up two second half touchdowns, and they gained only a handful of yards. And in fact, they finished the offensive performance. They finished with what was it, 232 total yards of offense. And it's, what was it, 40 something of those yards came in the final drive when, it was desperation time, right? It was a bad offensive game, especially in the second half.
Yeah, and it again comes back to what it was a disappointing day for Desmond Ridder, and something we'll talk about shortly. But it's one of those situations that this whole offseason, or this whole preseason, excuse me, can be summed up in the Clayton Tune halves and the Desmond Ridder halves, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
At least offensively.
Well, and one thing that we can say, we talked about on the show last week, is we actually learned how close this that it was a legitimate competition, because last week we talked about, well, Ridder got the start, then Tune played the second half, and we said, well, we'll see where the competition actually is, because if Ridder starts again and Tune plays the second half, it would suggest that the competition isn't necessarily as close as it is. But Tune started in the first half, so they're basically treating it like an open competition and not like, in air quotes, open competition, because every position has competition. But this is literally an open competition where they want to see who will do it. This is not like the left guard position where we're like, oh, working guys there and they're competing for the starting job, but who hasn't played at all this preseason? That's Evan Brown. He's starting at left guard. Which we suspected would be the case, dating back to the offseason and when we were doing the spring workouts, that Evan Brown was the guy. And guess what? That's been the case. And so what we see is that, and what it looks like is, as odd as it looks, it appears that Clayton Tune is firmly in the lead of this competition, don't you think?
Yeah, and it was, more than anything, it's been obvious based on the play on the field. Like, we can sit here and talk about investment and time in system, and we can talk about things like their experience and whatnot, but at the end of the day, there's just a non-debate at this point about who's been better in the preseason, and that's clearly been Clayton Tune. And when you look at that, it makes it really hard to judge everybody else, because the fall off's been bad, man. I think you and I can agree, like, this is probably the worst quarterback play from I know he's not a veteran, but a guy that's played NFL snaps in his career, that's played in 2 seasons. This guy's played over 1,100 snaps.
Yeah, when they traded for him, we liked the move, because what did the Cardinals need from a backup quarterback position? You needed experience, steadiness, and not expensive, which is all 3 things that Ridder had. He was, like, if you look at statistically, he is a very meh. He is just he's mid when it comes to quarterback play as a starter. He's got 8 and 9 as a starter. He's got 14 touchdown passes and 12 interceptions. Very, very middle of the road type play, which, hey, you kind of want that from a backup. He also has the plays with his legs. He's got 5 rushing touchdowns in his career. But like, when you watched him play in Atlanta, and you saw we talked about when the Cardinals played the Falcons last year, the roster looked like one, like the skill players, the players around him looked like that was a team that should be achieving more, and they were being held back by the quarterback play, and Ritter was a part of that. But the fact of the matter, he has been not good, and Clayton Tune has made improvements, and that I think that's the encouraging thing, as we mentioned in the show last week, is that how many times have we seen a young like a day 3 type prospect quarterback from one year to the next make significant improvement, and Tune has done that, both decision making and just ball placement. He looks comfortable now. I will say this: there was a time, remember, when Chris Streveler outplayed Brett Hundley for the backup quarterback job for the Cardinals, and when it came down to playing time, we probably collectively wish that it was Brett Hundley that was playing instead of Chris Streveler in 2021 or 2020, right?
Yeah, but I would counter that by saying, so they've been on equal playing fields basically, over these first 2 games. You had obviously Ritter got the nod in game 1 and Tune in game 2. So they've played with basically the same people, just on separate, occasions. And Tune's performance was markedly better in each situation. In fact, the fact that Ritter's performance was, I don't want to say substantially worse, but it was definitely worse with the 3s, 4s, 5s, kind of the end of roster guys in Indy. I mean, think about this, Jess. Before that last drive where he was 3 for 3 for, I think, 22 yards, he was 3 for 7 for 31 yards.
It was bad. It was not impressive in the least. And at least the one thing we could look at is like against the Saints, he was going against the starters with the second team everybody, and so understandably it looked bad. But then he looked bad again. Like the offense completely stalled. We've said this a number of times. When you have talented players, guys who have started NFL games, who are highly drafted guys, when you are in the second half of NFL preseason games, they are supposed to pop. Blaine Gabbert, when he was with the Cardinals in 2017, the summer Blaine Gabbert was great. Last year when Blaine Gabbert played against the Cardinals, he absolutely lit them up playing in the second half. It's because he is an experienced, talented NFL quarterback going against a bunch of guys who have or aren't that. Those are the questionable players for the NFL. Michael Carter playing late in games, he pops, and he should. Desmond Ritter, having started, a full season of NFL games, should be able to make plays against lesser defenses, lesser talent. And even with lesser talent around him, it just kind of shows what he was in Atlanta. He had great talent around him and was not able to elevate them. And unfortunately, as positive as I was when they made the trade for him, because obviously you didn't want to come into this year counting on Clayton Tune. Good job, Clayton Tune, for improving. But that trade, at least it didn't cost the Cardinals anything, because Rondale Moore was on his way out anyway. But it turns out that I'd say Ritter is probably the disappointment of the preseason.
I don't think there's any question, Jess. I think you're absolutely right about that. And there's been some other guys, but let's talk about at least some positives from this game, right? Because there were a couple, and I think you and I can start on the defense side of the ball, and I'll let you do. Which of the obvious 2 do you want to take? I'll let you go.
Give me Cam Thomas, because I've been waiting for this. I've been waiting for Cam Thomas because he's that guy. Like, he was a 3rd round pick that probably should have been drafted higher. Like, he should have been drafted higher, but he was hurt and had been playing out of position. And we saw the promise as a rookie, and he balled out against the Colts. It's the exact sort of things. Okay, all right, Cam Thomas, get yourself on the roster. Be at least a threat of a pass rush off the bench, and he did exactly that. He was disruptive, and for a guy who, as of 2 years ago believed he could start in the NFL, he absolutely dominated backups. That's what you wanted to see.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about it with Desmond Ridder, right? Why it's such a negative, and the positive and Cam Thomas is the other thing, is that he's looked out of place in that he looks too good. And that's not a bad thing, right? Like that's a positive thing. Like, okay, we need to get this guy some more shine. We need to get this guy some more run. The other guy, I don't think we can gush enough about, and we know it's going to be limited this year for the most part, but man, Dadrian Taylor Dimerson, Rabbit, he just looks fun. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if he's the heir apparent to Buda Baker, and quite frankly, I don't know if it's fair to expect him to come in and be that guy.
But doesn't he look kind of like him on the field?
And that's just it, right? Like, can you imagine if he pops continually like he has thus far? And you talk about going from Tyrann Mathieu to Buda Baker to Rabbit, and this is just a guy that looks like he was probably overlooked a little bit because of the age coming out. We talked about the other day, he's an older guy. I mean, he's 24 and a half already. He turns 25 in January, but I mean, that's a one contract, or that's a one extension type of guy. And he looks the part, man. And he plays it. He plays the game at such a crazy pace that it's really fun to watch what he can be, because it's oozing, right? It's just oozing potential, and we'll see obviously how much run he gets this year if he's the third safety. I would say he's clearly the best safety in preseason.
Yes.
And so maybe that earns him some reps on the field. But he has just looked smooth so far, and I'm excited for him, and that's good, man, because I wrote about it today. One of the death nails of the Keim era was obviously all the negative picks early, and those are easy to point to. But you go back and look at his day 3 picks, and those guys just didn't play. And not just that, a lot of them just didn't even stick around in the league, right? And that's
right.
And that's what I'm not saying you need guys that are starters. Those are bonuses, but you need roster guys, you need lead backups, you need those guys, and it didn't happen consistently. And we talked about Owen Papo.
That was the example I'm going to bring up. I'm like, he's an athletic freak, but look at year 2, he looks like, oh, okay. So you feel like he's, give him another year, and I don't know if are they going to re-sign Kaiser? But they could easily transition from him to have Mac play the Mike position
and put Papo at the week.
Yeah, I mean that's an ideal sort of transition you can make. I mean, obviously, like if Kaiser balls out, you can sign him, but to be in a position to do that's the thing that the Cardinals have never been able to do. No. Is that rather they set themselves up, and then, oh well, we can let that guy go if you want, and you kind of go back to they've done this in the past, like we're all the way back to the Rod Graves days. They had Calais Campbell as a rookie, which means that they were able to let Antonio Smith go in free agency. There's always guys that they're all like, all right, you can go because we have a guy here, and so you can choose to keep the big time guy, or if he gets too pricey, you've got a guy to replace him. This Cardinals just it hasn't worked out. It hasn't worked out for them really kind of any position, except, like, honestly, last year's draft was DJ Humphries gets hurt. They drafted Paris Johnson. You're like, well, okay. DJ's hurt. So bye, DJ. Paris, you're left tackle.
Right. And that's what it should be, right? And so you're looking at it now, and you're excited about the potential of it. And they're still making up for lost time, but what they have looks exciting, and it looks like it can be a positive overall. A couple other guys that stood out to me. You talked about Darren Hall quite a bit last week. I thought, he played, I think, the most snaps on the team, 51 snaps. He's given himself a shot to make a practice squad or find work in the NFL the way he's played this preseason.
And he played a little bit on special teams. I look at him because I feel Rabbit has secured that third spot. Like last year, they had Andre Sacheret being the third safety. At the beginning of the year, they had Kayvon Wallace, and then Sacheret filled in. I think Rabbit probably has earned that spot. And so that fourth spot's going to come down to a combination of upside on defense and special teams. And you've got Sacheret, who's steady on both. You've got Joey Blunt, who's a very good special teams player. And Darren Hall has he's been really good, and he gives you some positional versatility because he can play safety and guard and defend the nickel. And he played a little on special teams. If he can be a slightly plus special teams player, I had him in the 50-man on my latest 53-man roster because that's one of the spots I'm kind of watching for. But it'd be interesting to see how that plays out if he does play more special teams this week in the preseason finale, or if he might end up playing more snaps, period. But for me, another positive it was the way Trey Benson played, because against the running behind a second team offensive line against the Saints starters, he had a hard time, but we saw exactly what you kind of want to see. We saw explosiveness. He had 43 yards on 9 carries, but the truth is it should have been
even more
3 yards on 10 carries if it weren't for a holding penalty by Christian Jones. He had a 19-yard run. He had a 20-yard run called back. And so we saw some of the potential there, and that was good to see. It was just enough, just a smither, just a sprinkling of some big play possibility. And that's what we want to see from him. If he's going to be the Chase Edmonds to James Conner, and I feel this is going to be kind of like the 2020 Chase Edmonds to Kenyon Drake, as opposed to the heavy share. I think it's going to have to ease into that, but if he's going to have an actual role on offense, you wanted to see it early, and we did.
Yeah, and that's the big thing, right? Like, this is a guy that looked more comfortable in week 2. It's why all the negativity out of fantasy, it was mostly fantasy guys, I don't know, but they, it was strong, and I'm just like, I just want to be like, shut up. Like, this guy's first time running behind third stringers, he was getting hit in the backfield. Like, it is what it is. I do have to say, I feel like Isaiah Adams is not where he needs to be in terms of pass pro yet. And I don't think you and I are really surprised about that. But I thought he took a step forward this week as a run blocker, looked more confident, comfortable, and physical in run blocking, something that, we knew he would be good at coming from Illinois, and Brett Bielema. That's their bread and butter, and why Tip Ryman looks already like a 5-year pro when he's run blocking, right? Like, that's
he's strong and he squares guys up. It's real nice to see that guy. We remember, like, Trey McBride. Steve Keim raved about his ability to do kind of all the jobs because he run blocked a lot at college at Colorado State. But we remember there were so many mistakes by McBride that first year as a blocker, and Ryman already comes on. He's a seasoned pro at blocking, and he's proud of it, and he's the guy that you're like, we know what he is, but there's a little something extra that might be in there as a playmaker.
Correct. And so we'll see how that works out. But I thought he did a nice job, to pair with Marquise Hayes, who, continues to surprise me. Just looks like he's been a 3-year pro, right? Like, he's doing a nice job. This has probably been his best preseason so far. He looks confident and comfortable. I don't know if it's going to mean he makes the roster, but he's consistently been their best lineman in these 2 games.
And then on the negative side, oh boy, Christian Jones. I mean, we talked about last week how nothing stood out about his play one way or another. Oh boy, that was bad in the first half.
Yeah, he just looked overwhelmed and overmatched this game, and it was tough. And then to build on that, you had Dennis Daly, who's been cut now. He did not look good, and he only got 6 snaps. That was crazy. And then Elijah Wilkinson, he'll be on the roster. You kind of walked us through that last week.
His contract is 100% guaranteed, but hey, if he's not starting, like he's also getting a lot of reps at tackle. He's played tackle before, and he's going to be their guard tackle guy on the back end unless he's traded. I don't think anyone would trade for him, but you're going to be hard pressed to find him cut when he has. It's not just some guaranteed money. His full salary is 100% guaranteed.
Right. So it was, but he's been really not good, I guess is probably the best way to put it. So, you've had both sides of it, right? Like we've seen positives from the offensive line, negatives from the offensive line. We know how much work Adams needs to do in pass pro still, but the glimmer of hope in the run game is exciting. And then I just wanted to shout out your guy, Kyrus Tonga. I thought, he's not much of a pass rusher. He had a couple good hurries in the game, but he is stout in that middle. And I think he and Roy Lopez, right, could be a really interesting kind of rotation there where you're talking about maybe 35 to 40 snaps a game, and it's 25 a Roy and 5 to 10 a game for Tonga if he's able to make this roster.
Yeah, and it's going to be tough for Tonga to make the roster. I'm going to be fascinated because there are a few positions like the running back position, the defensive line, and the cornerback room. I'm like, how are they going to work that? Because there are guys that you feel that they're going to need to keep. But let's move on from that. Coming up next on the Rise Up Secret podcast, Best Hour of Cardinals Talk. Let's talk about the starters not playing in this preseason. What do we think of that? It's coming next on Rise Up Secret. We're back on the Rise Up Secret podcast, Best Hour of Cardinals Talk on the web. The Cardinals have made it very clear the way they view the preseason with their starters, especially now in year 2, where they know who the starters are, they know the system. They have chosen to go with they will practice them hard, and they will not play in the preseason. My son, Diego, who is a football guy for sure, he came to me the other day and he called Jonathan Gannon a moron. In other words, I don't think he said exactly moron. He probably used a few, fewer, less kind words about him because the starters are getting no live game reps. And I do understand why they wouldn't have this week because of the joint practices. You get those sort of live game reps in a controlled setting. I'm not 100. Like, I don't know what my thoughts are on that, because when you have your starters, we see it around the league. Guys get hurt, and it feels stupid. It feels stupid to have a starter get hurt in the preseason. But I don't know if not playing in the preseason, if it takes away from their preparation for being ready for the season. I guess that depends on the players, and it depends on the experience.
Yeah, and that's the hard part, right? Is like, what do you do with this? I think they're doing a good job of finding reps for guys that they had questions about. For instance, in this game, we saw a lot of Keitrell Clark. We saw a lot of Cameron Thomas. Obviously, rookies, we know that they're going to do that, but guys like Darren Hall, Xavier Thomas, those guys that are question marks, so to speak, they find ways to get them on the field, right? I think that's what they're doing right now, because one of the things we've talked about, and if they come out and get curb stomped by Buffalo, then we have a different conversation. But one of the things we've talked about is how razor thin they are. We like where they're at talent wise, and it feels like they're improved quite a bit, right? But at the same time, if one guy goes down, it could be curtains on the season. And so finding guys and making sure that you have some depth and getting those guys live bullets is important. And I think we're seeing that play out. Again, I think if they come out of this and they look awful, then it's the wrong decision. But for now, I'm not gonna question it too much, and I'm gonna let this play out and see where it goes.
Well, especially because you see a variety. You see a spectrum of this where starters play, like Andrew Reid, they play their starters. Other teams don't play their starters at all. It's just, but then you look at teams like the teams like the Buffalo Bills, and where are they at right now? Guess what? Marquise Valdes-Scantling, he's hurt. It's probably he might miss the season opener. Curtis Samuel, another receiver that they're counting on this year, he's hurt. Like, I'm not sure which is worse, whether like getting hurt in the preseason so you miss the start of the season. Now, granted, you've got time to prepare guys, or waiting to the season and then they get hurt. I don't know. I guess you see if the risk of getting hurt is the same no matter what, isn't it better to risk them getting hurt when it actually counts? I don't know. I don't know what.
And again, I think it'll be easier to judge that if they come out slow, right? And then we say,
right, if they're rusty and if they're out of rhythm. But the one thing that's nice is that with the way the NFL schedule works now, after the preseason, they get you get a full week of practice before game week, and so they can have another week of competitive practices so that you get those competitive reps before they go into week one, where they will then have the game planning. They've done some game planning, but next week after rosters are cut and they have the practice squad guys, they will be able to have some competitive practices, or at least more competitive sessions as they get ready for week one. And hopefully guys don't get hurt then, but that is the benefit to that. It allows your practice squad guys that they brought in, that they will have had a full week of practice before their first game week practice. And I kind of like the schedule, how it works now. I especially like that roster cuts are not on a Saturday afternoon, when the Cardinals like to be the last team to announce them. Waiting on a Saturday afternoon at 4 p.m., you're like, what are we doing? At least it's on a Tuesday. I've had my work day, and then just after the work day ends, I'm ready for the Cardinals to announce their cuts.
Yeah, and that's where we're kind of getting to at this point, because it becomes tough, man. I mean, it's a lot, and at the same time, it's while it's enjoyable, it's not always fun. And we're to the doldrums of that time where we just kind of want to see the starters play and see what they have and see what they can do.
I do have one question for you. Like, I get why Kyler's not playing. I get why James Conner. I get why Trey McBride. Do you wish that Marv had played more in the preseason?
I go back and forth. And the one thing that I would say is to know is because of who was going to be throwing him the football. And again, that's not trying to take a shot at these guys, but the reality becomes they're just they're not as good. And is that who we want showing or getting him into things? We can have the conversation obviously about should he or should Kyler be playing and things of that nature. But at the same time, if Kyler's not playing, I'm kind of the opinion that no, then he doesn't need to be playing. We can just go from there. And
we're getting I think it might be also just a little bit of the gamesmanship of, hey, we've got Marv. Let's not get game tape of him and how we use him until week one.
Yeah, and I 100% kind of believe that.
Yeah, so doing a little Kingsbury there, at least that they're not doing an entirely different offense that they have to relearn for week one like they did in 2019 for the Cardinals. Yeah, that was wild. That was wild. Coming up next on the Rise of Seared podcast, Best Cardinals Talk on the Web. Let's talk a little bit about the roster moves. What do we think of these roster moves? Is there any meaning to them? That's coming up next on Rise of Seared. We're back on the Rise of Seared podcast, Best Cardinals Talk on the Web. The Cardinals announced some roster moves on Tuesday. One that gives some clarity, and a couple that you're like, okay, this is an interesting thing. They signed a pair of defensive players. They got a former UFL special teams guy, and then they had a TJ Carter defensive lineman. They cut Dennis Daly, and we knew that was going to be cut. I know this. We almost always see this where a more veteran player gets cut a week ahead of time. As kind of a thing. And Jonathan Gannon said good things about Daly. The timing of it feels like a regular season cut because like he was the one that had the false start at the end of the game that ended the game. And they're like, that's the type of move you'd see NFL teams. Oh, you did that, you're out of here. But at the same time, he's a veteran player, and sometimes you're going to do right by your vets instead of cutting them at the very end when there's 1,000 other players available. Is that you release him so that you have at least a week for them to find a team before final cuts, and usually a team that's going to sign a veteran lineman is going to keep them at least to start the season. And so there's that move. So Daly wasn't making the team anyway. That's no big deal. But they add a linebacker, an outside linebacker. They had a defensive tackle. And here's the other one that's clarity. Guess what? Aaron Brewer remains the long snapper for the 9th straight year as they cut the undrafted rookie Joe Shimko. Not that I saw anything from Shimko that said, oh, he's definitely better than Brewer. But, I mean, that was perhaps one of the quiet roster battles that we couldn't really tell.
Yeah, and again, it was one of those situations where we're like, okay, what's going to happen, and then it just never really came to fruition. I don't think we're surprised though, right?
No, I thought it was I think that the addition of Shimko was just in case Brewer suddenly was over the hill, right? Like they knew Brewer, he's been great, but just in case, in case. You bring in some competition.
And I think that's where they were, and it just didn't, work out. And so, this was I'm not surprised. Like I said, I thought that they might continue where they were at. They ended up, looking at Shimko. He never made sense to me because he was just always so small, right? Like, so that was it'll be interesting to see if he gets on anywhere because he was unnoticeable, which is always a good thing, right? For long snappers.
Yeah. Now I did have a question about because I couldn't tell. So there's kind of 3 routes you could go with the signings that they got. Are they guys that they're looking for the back of the roster? Are they just bodies because there are injuries? Or maybe they're just bodies because they've already determined that there are some players we know have secured their roster spot and won't be playing on Sunday.
Yeah, I'm interested in that because I think you mentioned a couple, right? Cam Thomaso and Papoa. Those guys are probably locked in. We didn't see a ton in terms of this week of like LJ Collier played 9, Dante Stills or 12. Sorry, Dante Stills played 9 snaps. So are we going to see any of them in this week, or is this a chance for those guys to come in and get the reps to potentially get some film before they're back on the waiver wires? that was kind of my thought.
And that was I figured it's that, or there was an injury of some sort, and so they need bodies to make it through the game. But my guess is Cam Thomas won't play. Maybe Xavier Thomas doesn't even play because he's done well enough that they're just going to save him. And now, you got Victor McCagey and Jesse Luketa battles, but then you need if both Thomas kids are not playing, that means that's 4 outside backers who aren't playing, which means you only have Luketa, DeBakagi, Tyreek Smith, and then you need another body. And so that's where they bring in the Chris Garrett who can play that position. And then if LJ Collier or Dante Stills have locked up their spot, you need another defensive tackle so that you've got 5 or 6 to make it through the game. Kind of do it that route. And I wonder because they also worked out a tight end and a receiver, Sage Surratt, and it'd be interesting to see. Like, the injury part is always the part that I'm like, interesting. But I think, especially since last year, like we saw Keitrell Clark sit out the finale when he kind of had locked up a spot. And so even if they're a rookie, like they've done with Marv, if you've locked up a spot in the playing rotation, they're going to save as many of those guys until after cuts. 1, to determine the final roster spots, 2, to keep them healthy, and 3, it's an opportunity to give guys more tape, obviously, and so that's just part of the business.
Yeah, and I know people think that's silly, but it is a good thing. It creates a good, it gives you a little something for the league itself, where people are like, hey, I want to go play there. And because I know they'll give me a run and give, treat me well for that time being. And let's be honest, it's not like the Cardinals have the best reputation in the league. So anything that can help that is always a positive as well.
Coming up next on the Rise of Series podcast, the best of Cardinals talk. Let's talk about what do we think? We're not going to make a 53-man roster projection right now, per se. We'll react to that. Maybe we'll do one later in the week. Depending on what we're doing, but probably not. We'll just react to the new ones next week. But who are potential surprise cuts we could see happening, or guys that we see traded? Let's come on next Rise of Red. Back on the Rise of Red podcast, Mr. Cardinals talk on the web as we get close to cut down date. There's going to be some hard decisions made. Let's kind of look at who are some players that would be considered a surprise cut. Maybe not based on what we've seen surprise, but surprise based on what their status was on the roster at some point. Who do you think are some cut guys that they're talented guys that just there's no spot on the roster?
I think it starts with Michael Carter, right? Like,
yes,
it feels like he's done more than enough to make this roster, but if they only keep 4 backs and with what they're paying DJ Dallas, it feels like Carter's the odd man out.
Right. And can you pay a 5th running back $3 million? Because he hit an escalator and salary is going to make $3 million this year. Can you and really, with what the Cardinals want, can you keep 5 running backs on a roster?
I know, right?
and especially when it'd be one thing. Now, of course, someone might get hurt, right? And so you might need that. That said, I think Michael Carter is going to be you're going to be like, well, that sucks. He's good. He's a quality NFL player and just has found himself and just off of the roster spot. With the Jets, he kind of got pushed out, and the Cardinals, it's not that he got pushed out. It's just the numbers. They really like DeMarcado. They love DeMarcado. And they love what he does on 3rd down. They love what he does on special teams. DJ Dallas has guaranteed money. And when he didn't even play on offense on Saturday, he just played special teams, and it looks like he's going to be their returner. So it looks like Michael Carter there. We've talked about Desmond. Desmond Ridder is like, if you look in the context of the roster, you'd look at Desmond Ridder and would consider him a surprise cut. We've seen him play. It's not a surprise. Not a surprise that he'll get cut. Anyone else of note? I think I look across the roster. On the defensive line, someone's going to get cut that you're not going to be that you're like he deserves a spot. And I think one, you're going to either look at Kairos Tonga or Dante Stills. One of the two, I think, will find themselves off the roster because it's going to be hard to keep 7 defensive tackles on the roster, at least initially.
Yeah, I think the next guy is, and I don't think he is, because I think he's done really well this preseason, but Keitrell Clark, right? Like, I think he's made it. I think he's done enough, but at the same time, the the three, right? Starling Thomas, Sean Murphy Bunting, Garrett Williams, and then Max Melton's on this roster. You have to feel like Elijah Jones is going to make this roster. So that leaves one spot.
And so, yeah, you're looking at, and this is if they keep 6. Keitrell's the 6 if they keep 6, but what if they don't have room for 6?
Do they cut a third rounder?
Oh, I don't know. That's the hard thing. I think, and what I've done with all of my roster projections so far, I've kept 6 cornerbacks because I know how Gannon feels about Keitrell. And he has looked good. And so I'm just like, you're keeping 6 cornerbacks and you're just robbing another position is just essentially how I do it. And the way I do that every single time I've robbed tight end. And I know they like having 4 tight ends on the roster, but I think early on that's the position you go, because you're like, would you rather have Keitrell Clark or would you rather have either Blake Whitehart or Travis Vokalek? And to me right now, I'm like, I don't think Whitehart or Vokalek is going to get picked up anywhere, and either one of them. And if one gets picked up, you've got another on the practice squad that you can bring up each week if you need in the meantime, and you'd rather keep that young defensive back. It would be rough. Like, you'd hate to see a guy like Jones get cut from the 3rd round, but I mean, when you got 4 third-round picks, it's a little bit more understandable. But still, that would be a shock. I just don't think Keitrell could be, and
it's just like you said, it's a matter of if they keep 6.
Yeah,
I mean, that's really it.
Unless, remember when it looked like we thought, Christian Matthew made so many strides, and he was like cut like 3 games into the season. Star Thomas, what if he's like that?
Right, exactly.
Like, maybe they decide that, all right, we're just going to go with Max. We like what Keitrell can do, and we're just going to have to eat it with Star. I don't know, but I don't think so. It's just going to be tough. It's going to be tough either way. In terms of trades, I think Michael Carter, maybe. I think teams knowing, unless there's a situation where they find themselves needing a running back, I think Carter's a guy that's just going to go somewhere that he likes. I've seen the articles, and in terms of a best option to trade, Kelvin Beachum is a valuable trade asset for a team that needs a veteran tackle.
After Christian Jones' performance, though,
so you're left with, you don't have Kelvin Beachum, so you're going to rely on Christian Jones,
right? That's what
Wilkinson.
That's what I'm saying. After that performance, like, I don't think you're ready to do that yet, right?
What about this? What if? Could you see any scenario where behind the scenes Buddha's finally saying, "Come on, you've got Rabbit," and they trade Buddha?
No, I don't think so. Not this year. I think they've got more work to do before they're comfortable with that. I think I think they're hoping that he is ready. Rabbit is ready for it, but I just don't think it's this season. I truly don't. It's a lot to ask, right?
Yeah. I could see maybe it's kind of a name that, because of what Papo's done, this maybe Chris Barnes. Like, I know they like Chris Barnes. He played a lot last year, but if you're looking at a room where, okay, if you're ready for Papo to be the next guy up, and then you've got other linebackers behind that, Marcus Bailey's special teams guy. Maybe you like Trevor Nowoski for special teams or things like that. I don't think so, but that's a name that it wouldn't completely shock me if he got cut.
Correct. Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
At receiver, it's interesting. Like, I think they'll keep 6, and I think Xavier Weaver is receiver 6. But you know how I thought that Chris Moore was kind of a lock for the roster. I think if, like, for receiver 5, I'm not 100% convinced that it's not going to. I'm not 100% that it's going to be Chris Moore over Zach Pascal. I could see Pascal winning that spot again.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But, we'll see how that plays out. But it's interesting. I feel more certain about Weaver making the roster than I do about either Moore or Pascal. And I'm only keeping Weaver on the roster thinking that they're going to keep 6 receivers, which I guess would technically make him the 5th receiver. But I still, in my mind, like, they'll keep Weaver if they keep 6. If they only keep 5, I don't see them keeping Weaver over Moore and Pascal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, it's going to be a tough decision, but at the same time, it's like some of these guys have been clearly better than others, but at the same time, their comfort level or what their expectation is with guys, we just don't know heading into or out of this, because again, it's only year 2 with this group.
Mm-hmm. I personally would be surprised if Victor Dimukeje gets cut, because despite the defensive part, he is and has been for the last 3 years a core special teams guy.
Yeah, and I just don't think that they have enough depth to do it yet.
Yeah, but I could see a world where that is, but and I'm still convinced of this. Like, even when they were drafted, I didn't see a spot on the roster for Christian Jones or Tajon Palmer, and I don't think that there is still.
Yeah, I'm less convinced that those guys are on the roster than I was last week. I thought I had more faith in Christian Jones, but after last week, I have much less faith.
Although, those were guys that like practice squad, and then you go from there. That they make a practice squad guy. Those are fine. I would be, I guess perhaps if we're going to say, maybe the most surprising possible cut would be Elijah Jones. If they decide to only keep 5 corners, that Jones might be the one where you're like, oh, because he hasn't popped, right? He can play special teams. He has been nicked up a little bit at different parts of the offseason. And so, like, if there were a surprise, like a non-surprising surprise cut, I think Elijah Jones might be the guy.
Yeah, and again, he's a guy that
he's old.
Yeah. And it's just been one of those situations where he hasn't played as well as expected. And like you said, he's been kind of nicked up throughout the process.
Any other players of note? Do you think that the Cardinals will make any significant? I'm not talking about waivers. Do you think they'll add any veteran, like any chance at a Yannick Ngakoue? Like, to me, I think if they haven't done it yet.
Yeah, I was gonna say, doesn't it kind of feel like that ship has sailed, so to speak?
Right. Like, if they were going to do it, they would have done it already, so that he would have been in the system.
Let me ask you a question, because you're the expert on this way more than I am. Could they be waiting till after week 1?
That is possible. And maybe that like philosophically, you go with the guys that have been with you the entire time, and then you go, let's see how they do. If they're terrible and you're desperate, you can do it. But then, yes, after week 1, you can sign a veteran player and his salary is not guaranteed. Like, if a guy is on your roster and is active in week 1, if he's a vested veteran, his full salary for the year is guaranteed. And so after week 1, you sign a guy on Monday or Tuesday, and you sign him to whatever he's going to get paid. If you decide to cut him at some point, then you're only paying him the prorated amount that you had him on the roster for. So that very well might be. And I'm still convinced that, like, I think they like the guys well enough on their roster to do a good enough job for what they want from them this year, rather than and then carry over the 25 million in rollover cap that they think that they can have for next year, so they can make a bigger splash, rather than eating some of that this year for a guy that might make a difference in maybe a game.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that. I think that they're biding their time and being patient before, and I think it changes if they come out and they set the world on fire, and then you can expedite or change those plans. But I think going into this, they're not thinking too much about trying to push that immediately, right?
Yep. And with that, we will wrap up this edition of the Rise of Sierra podcast, Best Our Cardinals Talk on the Web, episode 580. That's Seth Cox and I, as we've talked about this preseason. We've got one preseason game left. Notice we really didn't talk much about the Broncos game because guess what? No one of any sort of importance is probably going to play that game. We'll just wrap up this show. We will sit tight on roster projections. Check out for roster projections on Revenge of the Birds and on cardswire.com for our roster projections and predictions. And then on our next show next week, we will react to the initial final roster. That's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. Thanks for listening. As always, we'll be back again soon.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up, See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms, so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, See Red, and of course, Rise Up, See Red.
Rise!